Their own hands. Let's talk about road safety with Grant Freedman from JVR Consulting Psychologist. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Now, it seems that people develop an alter ego when they're on the roads. They do things they would not necessarily do on any given day had they been looking at someone face to face. Why is this?
You find that people learn about driving and their attitudes and their approaches to driving from society, the broader values that we have. And if you have a society that's competitive and aggressive and challenging and has a very little respect perhaps for the lives of their own and for other people, then you'll see those same attitudes play out behind the wheel. And then if you have a look at people's, something like people's emotions, their mood when they're driving, which of course is impacted by alcohol or drugs and that as well, by fatigue, as we saw in some of your earlier segments, people actually then demonstrate those attitudes when they're driving. And so you see sometimes different behavior than what you'd expect from someone under normal circumstances.
Is it fair to say that, generalizing, of course, that the South African road users, the drivers in particular, are lawless?
I can't comment on the lawlessness, but it gets down to our attitudes about law enforcement and whether we can get away with things, and our perceptions of what the traffic officials and other law enforcement officials represent. Goes back to the broader societal attitudes towards authority in general, police and metro police and other law enforcement officials. And if we have a negative view of that or a disrespectful view of that, we're much more inclined, research shows, to disobey the rules. There are also cognitive or intellectual errors involved where we would think, well, it's not going to happen. They're not going to catch me. I can speed, and I'll just keep looking. And if I see someone or I see a camera, then I'll be able to slow down. That may not necessarily be based in fact.
And how do we compare to road users elsewhere in the world?
You'll find in Europe, in Australia, there has been much more work done on driver education, not only in terms of understanding and knowing the rules of the road, but also the mental, when you're driving, you're actually busy with a lot of psychomotor things at the same time. Thinking, people are busy with GPSs and music players and texting and so on, that people are more disciplined in Europe and in Australia, and I guess also there is a greater respect for the law and also of the consequences of breaking the law there, that you will actually.
Quickly, what advice do you have for people who, shall I say, are prone to road rage, and how can they manage themselves better? And also you touched on law enforcement. How do you think law enforcement can be tweaked, if I can use that term, to make sure that lives are saved on the road?
Sure. Law enforcement has to. They do, and what you've heard the traffic officials saying, watch out for speed, don't drive too close to following. You hear all of those things. What drivers need to do is they need to examine their attitudes towards safety issues. Do you really believe that you have a responsibility to keep yourself and others safe on the roads? And be aware of the mood that you're in. If people are down and angry, they tend to drive faster and more aggressively. If they are on the opposite side of that, very happy and optimistic, they tend to drive more aggressively, drive faster. So you need to also examine your mood. You need to examine, there's a thing called driver self-bias. You think that you can drive better than everybody else. You attribute certain negative characteristics to other people. You need to examine those beliefs that you have to say, is it really true, or am I just as much to blame, or just as much at risk here? And then finally is just to have common decency and respect for all the users of the road. It's not only your own personal Kailami, for example.
And very quickly, one of those myths that male drivers are better than female drivers. I take objection to that. But very quickly, attitudes to safety is one thing that you touched on. What do you think that we can do on a school level? Do you think we should introduce education or training or skills or somehow on how to be better road users from school level?
Absolutely. That is probably one of the most fundamental things that we need to do, is increase the education. And it's not only on the practicalities of checking in the rearview mirror and looking at the indicators, but it is be aware of your own reaction when you're driving, your tendencies when you're driving, and those of others, and how you respond to those interactions that you have with drivers on the road all the time.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Grant Freedman from JVC Consulting Psychologies, analyzing the psyche of a reckless driver.